Tonight, we're going to talk about fear, namely the increasingly obvious fear that Donald Trump and his team are feeling about 2020. Politico reported today that 4 states are set to cancel their 2020 Republican presidential primaries and caucuses. South Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, and Kansas are all expected to finalize the cancellations in meetings this weekend. The move would cut off some much-needed oxygen to Trump's long-shot primary challengers, former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, former Illinois Congressman Joe Walsh, and possibly former South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford. And let's be clear, none of these challengers are polling within a mile of Donald Trump, who currently enjoys near complete devotion among the Republican base. So why cut off the challengers? Why strand his potential opponents if Team Trump is confident that he will be the 2020 Republican nominee? What are these state parties so afraid of? Or are they not the ones who are afraid? Politico reports the primary cancellations stem in part from months of behind-the-scenes maneuvering by the Trump campaign. Aides have worked to ensure total control of the party machinery, installing staunch loyalists at state parties while eliminating potential detractors. The aim, Trump's officials have long said, is to smooth the path to the president's renomination. Again, why would they need to do that if they're so confident that Trump can beat the likes of 2 ex-governors and a former one-term congressman? Here's Joe Walsh reacting to the news a few hours ago on The Beat.
I think they're scared to death of this president having any other name on a primary ballot against him because he's imploding day by day. I think they're afraid. Look, that's not a sign of strength. You want to eliminate elections? You want to, take away the will of the people? You don't do that if you're a big, strong guy.
Okay, now, Joe Walsh is not right about a lot of things, but he's kind of got a point there. And while statistically none of the challengers is really threatening Trump's renomination right now, consider this statistic. Since 1976, no incumbent president who has faced a serious primary challenge has gone on to win re-election. Not one. Here's how Vanity Fair's Peter Hamby put the threat Trump faces if Trump's fitness for office becomes a viable conversation piece among Republicans and Republican-leaning independents for even just a few weeks next January or during the primaries in February. They will have accomplished something that nobody in politics has even bothered to attempt this campaign year, talking to center-right swing voters who are uncomfortable with the man in the White House. A primary might be the only chance to open up space between Trump and the Republicans who are looking for permission to vote against him next year. And it's not just the cancellation of primaries that seems to signal fear from Trump world about the election. According to Yahoo News, the president is panicking about his own VP. Behind the scenes, tensions have been mounting among Trump, Pence, and their top advisors ever since the GOP's resounding losses in the 2018 midterms. In the weeks afterward, Trump asked aides about replacing Pence on the ticket, and he asked again for their thoughts on Pence during his August vacation, according to Trump advisors. NBC News has not yet confirmed that reporting, but the Yahoo story is one more data point indicating that the Trump campaign is not superbly confident 14 months out from the election, and that they're willing to do almost anything to change the state of the race. We're joined now by Professor John Sides, who studies the behavior of the American electorate at Vanderbilt University. He's the author of the book Identity Crisis, the 2016 presidential campaign, and the battle for the meaning of America. Also joining us is Tiffany Cross, co-founder and managing editor of The Beat DC. And Charlie Sykes is also back with us. John, I'm going to go to you first just for some statistical analysis of this. The Trump campaign should be very confident. There's sort of a cult of personality around him among Republicans. Almost none will ever leave him, no matter what he does. However, they are closing off the possibility of a primary. Does that signal to you that they might actually be scared?
I don't know if they're scared or not, but I do know that when presidents have traditionally faced primary challenges that have been at least modestly successful, they're presidents who are dealing with rickety or even plummeting economies whose approval ratings are not particularly robust. And Trump is looking at some economic uncertainty given the jobs report today and other indicators, and his approval rating is still stuck in the low 40s, which is not a solid position for an incumbent president.
And so let me go to you on this. Are you still a Republican now, Charlie? You're still a registered Republican. Because the thing is that the Trump, he likes to speak very confidently about the economy, about his chance of reelection. Yeah. But the things he's doing seem to be to forestall even the tiniest possibility that he could be challenged. That does not sound like confidence to me.
No, and by the way, I describe myself as a political orphan. No, this move does not exude confidence, particularly given the fact that the polls would suggest that he's, in the upper 80s when it comes to support. But I also think there's some other numbers. There have been surveys showing that at least 40% or around 40% of Republican primary voters might be open to the idea of somebody else. There might be willing to vote for a protest candidate. So, for example, if these three long shot candidates together get, 36, 38% of the vote in one of the early primaries, suddenly Donald Trump looks more vulnerable. The hashtag winning is effective. So I do think that there's a little bit looking over their shoulder. But there's the other issue is, does the Republican Party really want to become full Trumpian? Do they want to not leave themselves any off-ramp? Do they not want to have any daylight between themselves and this president who may be going into 2020 with a whole host of political problems, like the story that we talked about in the previous segment?
I turn now to my fellow skeptic on the idea of political conversion, Tiffany Cross. We have this conversation all the time that there are no real converts. At least I've not seen evidence that there are a lot of political converts. But what do you make of this? Because there is evidence that at least the Trump people are afraid.
Right. So it's weird because I think the people around Trump might be afraid, but Donald Trump does seem surprisingly confident, in my opinion. I mean, look, he wants to be adored. It's not enough for him to be elected. He wants to have the love of the people. But, this is a man who's treated this presidency like a teenager testing their boundaries. It's like, oh, well, let me see if I can get away with this next thing. And I think a part of that reason is because he keeps a tight circle for the people who really know what's happening, who really know the dirt. And I just think with all of the U.S. intelligence agencies coming out saying that, look, we definitely have foreign adversaries interfering with our elections, what does Trump know? Why is he so confident? Because he certainly does not seem nervous in that sense. And regarding Nikki Haley, the rumors about her joining the ticket, possibly replacing her with Pence, or Pence with her, I think that's something of note. But look, I will say Nikki Haley's acting like somebody who's going to run in 2024. She's writing this book that's coming out this year. She started this organization, Stand for America. But does it matter who's on the ticket? I don't know. And it's funny when Charlie said that, that the GOP doesn't want a lot of daylight. Newsflash, there is no daylight. This is the party. Look at Ronna McDaniel. She is a sycophant for this man.
Romney McDaniel.
Romney McDaniel. I'm sorry. She played her own distant relative, to support this president. So it's a weird, incestuous fight happening in the Republican Party, but most people are sycophants. They are falling right in line with this administration.
Well, let me give you John Sides. I'm going to read you to you. Okay, this is you in Vanity Fair. This is what you read. You wrote about potential, per the mention of Romney, about Romney-Clinton voters. You wrote, all in all, back of the napkin math suggests that around 5 million voters supported Romney in 2012, but went on to back either Clinton or conservative third-party candidates in 2016. Whether they stay home in 2020, vote Democrat, vote third party, or reluctantly vote for Trump this time around, the choices these center-right voters make in 2020 will have an impact on the margins, when margins are everything. So you're not talking about people who voted for Donald Trump, who do seem to be completely enthralled and sort of not really winnable or movable. What about these voters, these Romney to Clinton voters?
So we're talking about maybe 5% of the American electorate that voted for Romney, but then voted for either Clinton or for a third-party candidate in 2016. And these are voters for whom their 2020 outcome is far from certain. Romney-Clinton voters, as we've been tracking their views since 2016, look pretty strongly Democratic. They don't approve of the president. They don't have a favorable view of him. They tended to vote for a Democratic House candidate in 2018. Romney third-party voters are a little different. They are not necessarily fans of Trump. They have an overall unfavorable view of him, but they did tend to vote more for Republicans in 2018. And right now, if you ask them, I think, their views of the 2020 race, they're probably more likely to say Trump than a Democratic candidate, but there are a large number of them that are uncertain. So the Romney-Clinton voters might be increasingly loyal Democrats, but the Romney third-party voters are still very much up for grabs.
Charlie, how many of them? I mean, do you believe that that a significant enough number of those voters exist that it's worth Democrats actually spending money to try to get them to vote for whoever the Democratic nominee is?
Well, I think that to keep them in mind, because I think you're probably talking about 3 to 5%, but that's enough to flip states like Pennsylvania Michigan, and Wisconsin. You know, there are the Romney Clinton voters. There are the people who voted for Barack Obama twice and then voted for Donald Trump. You don't need to turn them around. But if he loses 1-2% of the vote in northern Wisconsin, people who are disgusted by what they are seeing, that's going to flip the state. And it's all about the Electoral College, and it will all be decided by those states that he won by very, very narrow margins. So, you know, going back to this issue of the primary, you know, these candidates become vehicles. None of them are going to beat Donald Trump. None of them will be president. But they are vehicles for protest votes. And that's the kind of thing that I think does keep some of the Trump folks up at night.
Yeah, and I will say that, you know, particularly like a Joe Walsh type of character, he's going to be the nominee, but he fights like Trump fights.
Yeah.
And so is there some resonance to somebody who sounds the way Trump sounds then talking about what Donald Trump is doing to his own kind of world?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I think these people are specifically devoted to this president. But we do have to acknowledge that Bill Weld is polling in the double digits. I mean, imagine if somebody was running against Obama, polling in the double digits. It would get a lot more media attention. Of course, now trying to cover this administration is like trying to catch confetti, so we can't cover it all. But I wanted to talk about Charlie's point about, you know, kind of appealing to some of those voters, you know, those Romney Clinton voters. Look, they're still Republicans. You know, there's still ideological differences. So I think when you try to appeal to those people, you do run the risk. How can you appeal to them and then come back and talk to your base? Why not double down on your base and encourage those people and inspire those people to get out instead of, again, trying to appeal to Trump voters? I mean, I just want to ask, does the Trump vote just hit differently or what? Because why are so many people focused on trying to appeal to those people who are, you know, typically Republicans? I have never heard the Republican Party sitting around talking about how can we get these Democrats to come over to our side?
Right.
Only Democrats do that. So I don't know if that's a winning strategy for Democrats.
Yeah, and I guess the math question then is, John Sides, is it just as a statistical matter, are there more available Democratic voters, or are there, you know, who didn't vote last time, people who stayed home, or are there more of these Romney Clinton potential, we don't know whether they're movable, but those voters? Which is a bigger pot?
I think that's a really difficult piece of math, in part because it's hard to know exactly how many Democratic votes were left on the table for Hillary Clinton in 2016. In my mind, I think this may be a choice that Democrats don't have to make in some sense. If you're talking about Romney Clinton voters, you're talking about voters that, you know, a majority of whom want to impeach the president, at least in terms of the polling we've done in late 2018.
Yeah.
So there may be certain kinds of voters that are have not been loyal Democrats, you know, for decades, but are nevertheless on board with what Democratic candidates are likely to offer. And so you're able to mobilize the base and keep some of these kinds of voters on your side. For other groups of voters, like the Romney third-party voters, I think that's a more tricky question for Democrats.
Yeah,
their profile is just much more mixed.
That's always going to be the question: is if you got $100, where are you going to spend it? The base or trying to move people over? We shall see. Tiffany Cross, John Sides, Charlie Sykes, thank you guys for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.